It's right after the giving of the Torah, and now we've got to start to unpack what are the practical mitzvahs that we are supposed to do, which is what the parasha of Mishpatim will tell us. Why, though, does it begin with the story of Eved Ivri, of buying a slave? Is that the first thing we have to address? And besides which, practically at this point in Jewish history, when the Jews are in the desert, is the slave, the Jewish slave, even an option? Let's have a look at all of that based on a teaching in Rashi. Commenting on this pasuk about acquiring for yourself a Jewish slave, so Rashi quotes as his heading the four words, if you should acquire an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, or Pirush explains as follows. It means Eved Shehu Ivri. It means a slave who is Jewish. Then Rashi says, well, maybe you think it means something else. Maybe you would have thought that actually the Torah over here is talking about a Canaanite slave who used to belong to a Jew. So Eved Ivri means a slave of a Jewish person. And then the Torah would be telling us that that non-Jewish slave is released after 6 years, which would raise a question. What then, when the Torah later tells us that a Canaanite slave is yours forever, that would have to be that would have to be a non-Jewish slave that you purchased from a non-Jewish owner. So, but you would be convinced from this pasuk that if you purchase a Canaanite slave from a Jewish owner, he goes free after 6 years. Therefore, Rashi brings us a verse from the book of Devarim that tells us that we're talking about ki mocher achicha, it's your brother, somebody who's of the same caliber and status as you. It's referring to a Jewish person. So v'tzorich lahavin, we need to understand a few things about Rashi. We'll focus on three major issues about this Rashi that we need to understand. Number one, one of the rules that we've established about Rashi and the style that Rashi uses is that he'll only include in his heading those words that he intends to comment on. So here Rashi is defining for us what Eved Ivri means, that it means a Jewish slave, not a slave previously owned by a Jewish person. Why then does he need the words ki sikneh, when you will buy, in the headline? He's not explaining that. Okay, so maybe you'll suggest as follows. So, okay, maybe you'll suggest those words, ki sikneh, will help me to know that the servant, the servant we're talking about over here is Eved Ivri, is a Jewish servant. Soon enough, Rashi is going to tell us that ki sikneh, we're talking over here about an individual who is actually sold by the Beis Din, by the Jewish courts, for whatever reason, as we'll see, either because he is destitute or because he stole and he cannot repay the item that he stole. And that obviously, ki sikneh, the possibility of the Beis Din selling an individual as a slave, can only refer to a Jewish person. So maybe that's why Rashi included the words ki sikneh, because it helps to consolidate our understanding that it's talking about a Jewish slave. We cannot say that that's Rashi's motivation for two reasons. Aleph, Asharei Aleph, Hechech Zeh Shel Rashi, Shakos Medaber b'Machru Beis Din, and mitzad Yitura Dikra, how does Rashi know that ki sikneh is referring to a situation where the Beis Din is selling somebody? That's in the next Rashi coming up, where Rashi proves it from other verses. So in other words, you can't have circular reasoning. You can't say that ki sikneh is specifically talking about a case where the Beis Din is selling the person and therefore must be talking about a Jewish slave, because the fact that ki sikneh is talking about the Beis Din, we don't derive from here, we derive from other information that Rashi collates from elsewhere. And second of all, if that were true, adarabah, gam hechech zeh shemachru beis din mitzad hapasuk v'chi amuch achicha amur dafke lachar shekvar yesh neichacha mikodim shemedubar be'eved shehu ivri v'lo yishelev ivri. Actually, the fact that in the next Rashi can get into the conversation about the fact that the Beis Din is selling him is actually all predicated on this commentary that tells us we're talking about a Jewish slave. In other words, now that you know we're talking about a Jewish slave, therefore we can start to ask the question, how did he land up in this situation? Why is he being sold? And look at the order in which Rashi puts it. First, he discusses the definition of Eved Ivri, and then he discusses the detail of how he gets to be sold. So that's our first question. Why is Ki Sikneh part of the headline where apparently it actually has nothing to do with this conversation? It will become relevant to a different conversation that's still to come, but it's not relevant to proving to us that the slave is Jewish. Question number 2, a logical question. Why would you have thought that Eved Ivri means anything other than a Jewish slave? That's the most direct translation. So base. What would have prompted us ever to think that Eved Ivri should be translated as the slave of an Ivri, of a Jewish person? That's a real stretch. Surely, to say that Eved Ivri means Jewish slave and Eved who is an Ivri, surely that's the most obvious way to translate this. Actually, there are many places in Torah, some of which the student by this stage would have already encountered, where Ivri is used as an adjective for a person. So Eved is the definition, slave. Ivri is the adjective. What kind of a slave? A Jewish one. Like, for example, Gabi Nar Ivri, Dekoy al Yosef. Joseph is introduced in the Torah as Nar, a young man. What kind of a young man? Ivri, Jewish. Nobody would have suggested that means that Yosef was the young man belonging to or of another Jewish person. I mean, that's too far-fetched. V'gam benach, we also have an expression later on, right at the end of Tanakh in Divrei Hayamim, l'sheishan eved mitzri. Shepiroshe eved shuhu mitzri. There you've got it really clearly. There it says that there was this person who owned a slave who was Egyptian, not a slave who had previously belonged to an Egyptian. So why would we have ever thought that Eved Ivri would mean anything other than Jewish slave? V'chein, leidach gisa, muchach miloshen akosov Eved leish amoleki, shekasher kavanas apostol kula avdoi shel amoleki, eino oimer Eved amoleki, elo Eved leish amoleki. Now we have another proof to the contrary, that if the Torah wanted to say that somebody was the slave of an individual, it uses that word. It says, le, a slave to so-and-so. Like in the book of Shmuel, the slave to an Amalekite. It doesn't say he was Eved Amaleki, it says he was Eved le Ish Amaleki. Le Ivri, that's what it would have said over here. So what prompts us in the first place to believe that maybe over here Eved Ivri actually means someone non-Jewish who belonged to a Jewish person? It's really convoluted. Kama meforshim kosvu shehava min avdi shel Ivri himitzad dir kaloshen ki sikne Eved Ivri shmeloshen ze mashma shanikne kfar hoyo Eved mikoidem umemele mistavle forish dainu avdoi shel Ivri. Okay, so some of the commentaries want to say ki sikne. What's the Torah saying? Ki sikne, you're going to purchase somebody Eved. 1 second, that sounds like he's already a slave, even before the purchase happens. Ki sikne, you're going to acquire. Who are you going to acquire? It doesn't say, Ki sikne ivri le'eved, you acquire a Jewish person to become a slave. It says, Ki sikne eved, a person who's already, apparently, defined as a slave, ivri. And maybe that means he's already a slave to a Jewish person. Okay, maybe that's why we thought. The Rebbe is not satisfied with that. But that's not a good enough argument. Let's assume that's true. Let's assume that a face value reading of the text makes me believe that we're talking about a non-Jewish slave who used to belong to a Jewish person. Then that would have been the first issue that Rashi would have tackled, because that's staring you in the face, so Rashi has to talk about it. And then the first thing he should have said is, Yochol avdoi shel ivri al derech dugma. He should have said something along the lines of, oh, reading this, you might think we're talking about a non-Jewish slave who used to belong to a Jewish person. And then Rashi would have quoted the verse that it's talking about ki mocher achicha. It's talking about later on selling your own brother, so therefore we know it's a Jewish person. That would have helped us to understand that we're talking about a Jewish slave. But that's not what Rashi did. The fact that Rashi opens his commentary by saying Eved Ivri means a slave who is Jewish, that proves that is the most obvious translation. Rashi doesn't have to justify it. He just puts it out there as a fact. Eved Ivri means a Jewish slave. And then once he's put it out as a fact, he says, I know you may still second guess this, and you may believe that we're talking about a slave who belonged to a Jewish person, so let's settle that score. But it's not his first concern, so that implies it's not the first way you'd read the pasuk. Okay? Question 1, why does he include ki sikneh in the headline? Question 2, what would prompt us in the first place to think that Eved Ivri does not mean a Jewish slave? Question 3, why is Rashi at this point discussing the fact that later in the Torah we'll be told that Canaanite slaves are ours forever? We already know well that Rashi's principle is he'll only discuss things that are problematic to understand based on what we're reading now or based on things that we have learnt in the past. Why would Rashi here address a question that we'll only become aware of later, in the end of the next book of the Torah? And especially because Rashi doesn't even indicate what his source is, because if he had indicated his source, that he's talking from the Mechilta, which is Midrashic, okay, then you could say we understand why we're expanding beyond immediately what meets the eye. But he doesn't. And the fact that he doesn't talk in any way about the Medrash, that tells you that whatever Rashi is addressing over here, whatever Rashi is concerned about over here, is relevant to the pshat, the simple understanding of the pasuk, as it appears here and now. So what's bothering Rashi? Eved Ivri seems so straightforward, Jewish slave. Why? Ki sikneh. What don't we understand about ki sikneh? Why would you have thought that Eved Ivri means anything else but a Jewish slave? Why do you have to bring in sources that we are not yet aware of? So Vabiru Bozeh, the explanation is as follows. Because of Li'il Mesupar. Just a little earlier in the previous parashas, we read some interesting information, all of which seems to indicate that a Jewish slave is not a possibility at this point in time. Because what have we read? We read Shebitzias Mitzrayim not nimam b'nei Yisrael riboy klei chesef v'klei zav v'chulei. We previously read that when the Jews left Egypt, they left mega wealthy, 90 donkey loads of all kinds of wealth per person. L'achrei zeh nitosef them oid kesef v'zav v'chulei b'bizas hayam. And as wealthy as they may have been at that point, they became even wealthier after the sea, because we know that the Egyptians adorned their chariots with huge amounts of gold and jewelry. And the Jews got all of that. As Rashi himself points out, he says, after the splitting of the sea, Moshe literally had to drag them away. He's Sion Baal Korcham. He had to force the Jews to leave the site of where the Egyptians had washed up on the shore. Why? Because the Egyptians had adorned their chariots with all of this beautiful stuff, precious metals and jewels. And what happens is, and the Jews found them now on the side of the sea, and the wealth that they accumulated at the edge of the sea was greater than the wealth that they took out of Egypt. Bottom line is, what's clear is that Hashem's promise originally to Abraham that his descendants would leave Egypt with tremendous wealth had happened. There are no poor people in this story. They are mega wealthy Jews. Which leaves us with a simple logical conclusion. So it's now illogical that there could have been a Jewish slave at this point in time. Because what's a Jewish slave? Somebody who's so poverty-stricken that he sells himself in order to look after himself, or somebody who's so poverty-stricken that he lands up stealing, and as a result of that, he can't pay back, and now he's got to be sold. But if everybody is wealthy and sitting in the lap of luxury, this is a purely hypothetical case at this point in time. So why is the Torah talking about it now? Zman Kotzer Achei Yetzias Mitzrayim Kriyas Yamsuf, seeing as Parshas Mishpatim is very shortly after the story of the giving of the Torah, which is not long after the story of the Exodus and the splitting of the sea. Mistaver Shelchol Orei Shama Kodesh Baruch Hu Lifnei Yisrael Es Mishpatim Batzivuyim Oidei Sadvarim Anogim V'Amtzuim Tekef Oises Manu Matzav. You assume that the first items on the agenda to be taught to the Jewish people surely were things that were directly relevant at that time. For example, at the end of Parashas Yisro, where the Torah warns us, don't make gods, don't make graven images out of gold and silver. Now you've got to address that, because these people have so much gold and silver that we know later on it's going to turn out that too much gold and silver leads them to bad things. So they have to be warned about it. Or the fact that they had to make an altar out of the materials that they had at their disposal, sand and rock. Mizbach kesef hainu loy oy lav dafka mizbach kesef ezav after the cholechem emoyiru b'kol kesef ezav. And the fact that it had to be made out of sand, that's something Hashem had to express, because you've got so much gold and silver, you would be dafka tempted to make a mizbeach out of gold and silver. So I have to tell you that the requirement is the mizbeach should be made out of earth. Now that makes sense, because that's their situation. They are sitting with all of these assets, so they have to be told immediately laws that relate to having all those assets. לאחר שהקטים רש"י עבד שהוא עברי, הנשאל לא שנעבד עברי פירוש כפשוט עבד שהוא עברי, הוכרח לא הוסיף עיין אלא עבדי של עברי. Now we can understand Rashi's thinking. Rashi looks at the pasuk and he says, listen, we all agree Eved Ivri at the simplest level means a Jewish slave. So that's the translation. Let's put that out there first. Eved Ivri means Avdoi Shel Ivri, he's a Jewish slave. Now you have to ask yourself a logical question. Why would we be talking about a Jewish slave at this point? Maybe we should be talking about a Canaanite slave, which is more likely at this point, because the Jews are too wealthy to become slaves. So mitzad hemshech v'seder aksuvim, hasforim mechayeves, once you look at the flow and the chronology of the verses, your mind starts to tick over and you say, Shemedubar kan be'avdoi shel ivri, that it's far more likely at this period of time that instead of the Jews being the slaves, it's far more likely that the slaves belong to the Jews. Evet Kanani Shalkachtem Yisrael, that we'd be talking about a Canaanite slave bought from one Jew who's buying it from the next Jew. Why would I think that? Because the Jews were mega wealthy, and that included that included that they had servants, they had a whole staff, male servants, maid servants. Which is why it was the most obvious thing in the Ten Commandments, speaking about the laws of Shabbos, to address slaves and to address maidservants, because that was their reality. So this is what Rashi is thinking. He says, I get it that Eved Ivri means a Jewish slave, but I can understand why you would think it means a non-Jewish slave, because it's more likely that the people at the time owned slaves rather than they were slaves. Now the child who's learning this could have the following question. The child, who's obviously quite a sharp child, despite him being 5 years old, will remember, one second, I know about slaves. I've heard about a slave before. Our forefather Avram Avinu had a slave called Eliezer, who was there even before Hashem made the first covenant with Avram Avinu. V'nish'ar Eved Avram gam asiriyos b'shonim lachrei, and he remained the slave to Avram Avinu for so many years. So can you see where the child's thinking is going? Okay, so if you're telling me that this pasuk is actually talking about a non-Jewish slave and he has to go free after 6 years, one second, what happened to Eliezer? Why was he a slave for so long? The bris beina besorim, the covenant that Hashem made with Avram Avinu, was long before there was such a thing as Yitzchak. And Eliezer is still Avram Avinu's slave when it's time to find Yitzchak a wife when he's 37 years old. Well, so when he's 40 years old. Seeing as this child already knows, as Rashi has already taught him previously, that Abraham kept the entire Torah before it was given, how would it be acceptable that Avraham Avinu would have kept a Canaanite slave Eliezer for so long? If ostensibly the Torah is saying the slave of a Jewish person has to be released after 6 years. So this child is going to think, 1 second, it sounds like the slave we're talking about is not Jewish, because the Jewish people at this point in time were wealthy and they could never be slaves. So therefore it sounds like the kind of slave we're talking about is Avdoi Shel Ivri, a slave who is Canaanite but belongs to a Jewish person, in which case the child says, if that person is supposed to be released after 6 years, how did Abraham break that law? Therefore, Rashi has to address this issue, because this child is going to have a concern that Avraham Avinu, God forbid, did not keep a law. But instead of wording it, Rashi could have worded it as, wow, what's going on over here? You think we're talking about a Canaanite slave, but what about Avraham? He says, I have a better, stronger way to illustrate the point that it's problematic to suggest we're talking about a Canaanite slave. What could be stronger than questioning Avram's conduct if we have a blatant pasuk that seems to contradict the principle that we're learning in this pasuk? There you go. I've got an outright pasuk in the Torah that says, Rashi says, what about that pasuk? That you keep a Canaanite slave indefinitely. So now we've got a clash of psukim. One pasuk says, Canaanite slave you never have to release. And according to some opinions in the Gemara, you're not allowed to release. And here we've got a pasuk that says, Avdoi Shel Ivri, the Canaanite slave of a Jewish person goes free after 6 years. Contradiction. So therefore, and then if you're going to say, well, actually the only time where you can keep the person forever would be what? If you bought the non-Jewish slave from a non-Jewish owner. Good, now Avraham Avinu would be saved, because Avraham Avinu would have bought Eliezer from a non-Jewish person, obviously, because Avraham is the first Jew. That would justify how he could keep that slave indefinitely. Now we're starting to understand why Rashi had to include those key words, ki sikneh, when you will acquire a Jewish slave, because that consolidates his interpretation that the slave himself is Jewish. Truth be told, at face value, this pasuk could have worked just as well without the words ki sikneh, should you purchase a slave. Could have just started off simply. A Jewish slave works for 6 years. And that's absolutely acceptable. We don't have to say, if you buy a slave, well, the fact that he's a slave implies that somebody's bought him. Many places in the Torah, we jump straight into the practical law, not the backstory of how the law happened. Like in this parasha, a person who attacks somebody else and kills him. We don't get the backstory of why did he attack him, how did he attack him, was he provoked? We just get to the part that's going to present in court. So-and-so killed so-and-so. So what's the part that's going to present in real life over here? So-and-so became a slave. How long is he a slave for? The minute the Torah uses the word ki sikneh, if in the future you will buy a slave, that shifts the context of this particular discussion. That implies that currently in the desert, with all of the wealth that the Jews had, Eved Ivri is actually not a possibility. It's not just that it hasn't happened at that period in time, it cannot happen. The prospect of a Jewish slave is an impossibility at this point in time, because it requires poor people, and nobody's poor in this society. Which then illustrates to us now it turns out that the pasuk is talking about the scenario of buying a Jewish person as a slave, which could never have happened at that time. And now I know that we're not talking about a Canaanite slave. The fact that it's talking about a future incident, not a current incident, shifts me away from thinking that we're discussing a Canaanite slave and helps me to appreciate that there will be occasion in the future to facilitate the possibility of a Jewish slave. שביחס אליו פסיכס הכוסף כי סקנה אינה מתאימה והיא למויסר שהרי מצד רוב אושרם בוודאי היו לבני ישראל עבודים כנענים ופשיטה שאפשר לומר שאין זה דבר ההווה והרגיל. If I was talking about a Canaanite slave, I wouldn't say ki sikneh, that it's going to be sometime in the future. Torah doesn't waste words. The Torah wouldn't then just be saying, if you happen to buy a slave, this is what it is. The Torah specifically chose a future tense phrase to tell us that this is a scenario that's still to come and wasn't relevant at this point. Move on. The only thing is that then raises a different question. מדוע BMS פוסח הכוסף אז דיני המשפטים תכף להחמתן תורה בדיני ודברי? Why, in fact, if this is not current and it's not relevant right now, why is this the first conversation after the giving of the Torah? Parashas Mishpatim, which is supposed to spell out a whole series of laws that were all given at Har Sinai, as Rashi tells us in the very first Rashi on the parasha, that just like the preceding parasha was talking about things that happened at Har Sinai, this is also directly from Sinai. Why this mitzvah? This is not relevant right now. Why would the Torah initially discuss something that was not relevant at that time and not common? Besides which, the most common way in which a person becomes a slave, a Jewish slave, is because the person stole and they was then required to pay double or 4 or 5 times the amount depending on exactly the nature of the theft. And if he can't pay, then he gets sold as a slave. So logically then, surely then, the Torah should have started with the laws of theft, then the fact that there's a penalty for theft, which is that you pay double or 4 or 5 times, and then after that you could talk about slaves. Why do you jump straight into slaves? Slaves that are not going to happen during these people's lifetimes. And then you have to wonder, wow, this is actually the most obvious question of the lot. Why doesn't Rashi address it? Rashi addresses all the obvious issues. Many of the other commentators tackle this question because it's such a glaring question. Surely, logically, first start by telling me the laws of theft, and then the laws of the penalties for theft, and then what happens if you can't afford those penalties. Rashi, not a word. Not a word. Most obvious question, doesn't say anything. Don't try and sidestep this by saying that it's not a question when you read the Torah at face value. Because maybe you'll say that at a pshat level, I don't have to have a logical sequence to how mitzvahs are taught. However they present. Doesn't make a difference in pshat. Maybe that would be your sidestep. Well, this would be a really bad parasha to try and argue that the sequence of how mitzvahs are presented is irrelevant, because Rashi at the beginning of this parasha highlighted the importance of the sequence. That we come straight from Sinai into Mishpatim to teach you that even those rational mitzvahs come directly from Hashem's voice at Sinai. Besides that, שנסמך המצווה מצה דביסס מצרים והיום הוא הסבורה דהכוסל כדאיתך בפירוש רש"י שאין הכוונה הכוסף לעבד עברי אלא לעבד כנעני. Besides the general principle that there is a sequence to mitzvahs, this Rashi depends on that sequence. The only way that Rashi is 100% convinced we must be talking about a Jewish slave, and the whole debate of why we have to explain away the possibility of a non-Jewish slave, is only because of sequence, because of context, because we're talking about wealthy Jews, and that's why Rashi has to address these questions. If the sequence was irrelevant, then skip that question too. And therefore we are back to our original question. How does it make any sense to be tackling the question of an Eved Ivri before you've even introduced the principles which would lead to an Eved Ivri happening? You haven't discussed Geneva. Why are you discussing this? And why is this the first item on the agenda, straight after Har Sinai, first of the Mishpatim? So Rashi may not address that right here, but it doesn't mean he doesn't address it. It's coming a little bit later. Because later on, one of the things that we discuss is what happens if the slave chooses to extend his tenure. So the Torah says 6 years, that's it. He says, no, I love it here, I'm happy, I'm treated well, I don't want to go anywhere. So what do we do with him? We pierce his ear. Says Rashi, why the ear? Why don't we put a hole in his finger? I don't know, whatever. Why do we make a hole in his ear, of all things? Says Rashi, quoting the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, this is the ear that heard Hashem say, don't steal, and this guy went and he stole. So his ear should be punished, or should carry the mark of punishment. But not everybody is a slave because they stole. Some people sell themselves because they're destitute. So then we say, there we say, Hashem said very clearly that the Jewish people are my slaves. Nobody else has any authority over us. And this individual somehow ignored that and decided to allow himself another master. That ear that didn't listen must carry the mark of punishment. What's going on over here? What's Rashi telling us that's so important? What's so important about this particular scenario? About knowing why the ear is singled out? Well, what's important about that will help us to understand why this is the first discussion in the parasha of Mishpatim straight after the Torah. Generally speaking in the Torah, even though we are told that certain behaviors carry consequences, generally the Torah does not tell us why that consequence or that reward is specifically suited to that mitzvah or to that transgression. Let's use a mitzvah as an example. We're told that if you respect your parents, you get a long life. Well, first of all, a person can honor their parents. You won't know that they're living a long life until much, much, much later. So you don't see this immediate correlation between the behavior and the consequence. Besides that, when you look at a person who's 120 years old, you don't see, I can see in that honoring your parents. I don't see that. I just see a person who's living long. and I might not even know anything about their parents and how they behaved. So it's not that there's a clear, open link between the behavior and the consequence. That's on the positive side. The same applies on the negative side. If a person, God forbid, has to be given lashes for a sin that they've done, or worse, kores, to be excised and cut off from Hashem, there's nothing to illustrate the connection between eating chelev fat and kores. It doesn't seem to have a connection. What about kores is related to fats of meat? But now we have a unique scenario here in our parasha with the story of the Jewish slave. Here the Torah goes out of its way dafka to link the consequence and the behavior. Here the Torah is making it clear, as Rashi points out, why is the punishment in the ear? Because the ear didn't listen. Now the truth is, by the time you reach the point that the owner has to drive a nail or whatever it is through his ear, it's years after the Aveira, years after this guy stole. And it's after this person insists that in spite of having hit the 6-year mark and he should be going free, he doesn't want to go free. I have to go, man. Even if we want to criticize this person for, hey, the Torah says you should go free and you're not supposed to have a master. Still, the fact that he is choosing to stay on, that's not what we're punishing him for. We don't punish him for loving his circumstances. What do we punish him for? We're punishing him now for something he did years ago. We're not punishing him now because he doesn't want to leave. We're piercing his ear now because years ago he stole, or years ago he behaved as a Jewish person should not behave, to be willing to accept somebody else as his master. That's really important for us. Now that helps us to understand why this mitzvah of the Eved Ivri, of the slave, is the first mentioned after Har Sinai. Why? Because be'Eved Ivri nire be'onshe boifen goloi v'niker gam begufi hogashmi hakesher ben mishpatoi lahar Sinai. Because this is the first case, and possibly the only case, where there will be an indelible mark on this person's body to remind him and everybody who sees him of the link between his consequences and Har Sinai. You can see the connection. You didn't listen at Sinai, therefore you have consequences. It's not because you were a bad person, not because society feels that what you have done is not acceptable. It's because at Sinai you were told a certain behavior and you didn't follow it. Based on Rashi's explanation, Nimtza, Shechidesh Ikri Bedinei Eved Ivri Hu Etzem Ma Shelo Nishma La'tzivoi Behar Sinai. It turns out that the core reason why this person is being punished is because of a core principle, not listening at Sinai, not listening to Hashem's presentation of the Torah. The fact that he's in a position that he can't pay back the retribution that he's supposed, the remuneration that he's supposed to pay back for having stolen, that's a side issue actually. That's not the core problem of it. It's the technical process by which he lands up being a slave. Therefore, the Torah wants us to be clear that the big issue at play over here is what? The fact that you didn't listen. And what you didn't listen with, that's already a detail. So effectively what we've illustrated over here is why Rashi was concerned that you might think we're talking about an Eved Ivri, how this is something that's only going to happen in the future, ki sikneh, why he has to bring a very clear, apparent contradiction, because what else would we do with the story of Avraham Avinu? You need to settle that and explain how Avraham potentially could have kept a slave for a period of time, because he bought him from a non-Jewish person. Then coming back to explain, actually, that's not the case. We're talking specifically about an Eved Ivri. Why is this the first law that we learn straight after the giving of the Torah? Because it's the one law that highlights the direct correlation between consequences and the Torah. Now this, the way that we've explained this is going to give us another perspective, another depth of perspective to this whole story. Let's assume circumstances were different and the Jews were not these wealthy people. Let's assume that it was actually possible to have a slave, a Jewish slave, while the Jews were in the desert. Then, then we'd say, okay, listen, so obviously this is something you discuss now because it's relevant now. But the fact that we have now proven that the idea of an Eved Ivri is completely irrelevant at this point in time, could never happen at this point in time, that highlights for us the point that we have just made, that we're not discussing an Eved Ivri now because it is relevant now. In practice, we're discussing it because it's relevant now in principle, because this is the mitzvah that will illustrate to us that the consequence and outcome of every mitzvah or every avera always links back directly to Har Sinai. This is all a whole lot richer when you look at it from the perspective of Chassidus. Why did Hashem give us the Torah? So that we could use the Torah and mitzvahs as a means to refine, elevate, and transform our world. Whereas the Torah and mitzvahs performed by Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and their families prior to the giving of the Torah had a deep spiritual effect on them as individuals, but could not shift the world in any meaningful, tangible way. So which mitzvah is the best mitzvah to discuss straight after the giving of the Torah? A mitzvah where you can see the impact of the holiness of Torah in the physical reality of a person's life, in the physical reality of this individual. And specifically this concept of the impact, the kedusha of Torah seeping into the physicality of the world, is something that is represented by the concept of Eved, Ivri in spiritual terms. There are three kinds of slave that you could have. There's a Canaanite slave, a Jewish slave, and then there's a Jewish maidservant. And in Hasidus we explain that they represent different ascending levels of spiritual commitment. It's explained in Torah Hasidus, like for example in Derech Mitzvisecha, that al dvar gimel mahamadregas Eved Kanani, Eved Ivri, v'ama Ivriya ba'avodas Hashem b'nefesh ha'adam. We identify all of these three elements: the Canaanite slave, the Jewish slave, and the Jewish maidservant, as three different stages of serving Hashem, three different stages of spiritual development. From bottom up, Eved Kanani hu mishenafshe abamis betokfa avda befkera nichele. A person who is still considered an Eved Kanani is the kind of person that the Gemara talks about, where it says that the nature of a slave is that he'd rather be doing nothing. He'd rather have no authority over him. That's a person whose animal soul is absolutely still alive and kicking. And therefore, and that's why this is a person who is very strongly drawn to the temptations of this world. But he's an Eved, which means he's an Eved, that means he still does his job. Just like the slave who would much rather be out playing golf still does his job because he's afraid if he steps out of line, maybe he's going to be punished. That's this kind of person. I'd rather be doing something else right now, but I do what I'm supposed to do because I'm afraid of the alternative, or because I have respect for my master. Whereas the person who's considered a Jewish slave is at a higher spiritual state. This is somebody who the enthusiasm and the traits of his godly soul have started to seep into the reality of his animal soul. To the extent that even his animal soul is enthusiastic to connect to Hashem, wishes not just to play golf, but to learn Torah and to do mitzvahs. Elo. שטרם ניסבך לקדושה שלא לחמוד הסתיו בסלם הזה על דרך עבד המביא על הבייס אסכולה היסטרכוס מן הבייס באכיל ושתייה אלא שהמאכולים שמביא עדיין אינם ראויים לאכיל הסודם. But this person is not exactly 100% yet where they need to be, because this person might very well behave in line with what Hashem wants and be enthusiastic about it, but they're not absolutely immune to what's out there. And they don't never think about maybe, and it would be nice, and I'm wistful and nostalgic. And that's why an Eved Ivri is compared to the person who brings the raw wheat into the house, but it's not yet edible. So he's brought it into the right territory, he's brought it across the threshold, out of the realm of impurity, but it's not yet where it needs to be. Which means now the wheat hasn't yet been cooked, implying that the person's behavior, characteristics, etc., haven't been fundamentally transformed yet. And then if a person can graduate to the level of the maidservant who can actually marry into the master's family, that's somebody who has done such an incredible job of moving themselves and elevating themselves that they've transformed what used to once upon a time be the drive for temptation is now 100% a drive for holiness. So the same enthusiasm that this person used to have to do the things that were their leisure activities is the same kind of enthusiasm that they now have to do exactly what it is that Hashem wants. That's why we can understand that the very first topic on the agenda when we discuss Mishpatim straight after the Torah is given is it's the middleman. We're talking about this individual who's on the spiritual journey, certainly not falling apart and certainly not 100% in mastery of self. Because really the Eved Ivri represents what we're supposed to begin to work on ourselves to achieve once the Torah has been given. Our job straight after the giving of the Torah is to gather up the raw materials of the world and bring them into the territory of Kedusha. Bring our behaviors, our interests, our intellect into the world of holiness. We don't at this stage want to be an Eved Knani anymore who's doing what they should, but hasn't actually transformed anything. That's not enough. And then later on in the parasha, we discover that, there's even a level beyond that. So we start with the level of Eved Ivri, which is bringing our normal activities into a framework of holiness. And then we discover down the line that you can even graduate to the point of Ami Ivriya, somebody who is absolutely connected and dedicated and willing and ready to become united with Hashem completely. And then we have the capacity to completely transform everything that we have to be a conduit for Hashem's holiness in this world, a home for Hashem here on earth. So that's the first thing we have to learn straight after the Torah is given, is that it's our responsibility to take everything in our sphere of influence and bring it into the realm of holiness.